I'll try to just speak loudly.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. So this is about, it's about the St. Croix Trail, but it's also about the Northwest Sands ecological landscape, which is our sand barrens that extend on a trajectory from near St. Croix Falls to near Bayfield.
There we go.
Okay. There. It extends on a trajectory from near St. Croix Falls up to near Bayfield. And this is an outline of the Northwest Sands ecological landscape. And the geology will help you understand how the trail came into being. So the black outline is basically our sand barren. So this is our area with scrub oak and jack pine that we're familiar with around here. If you look at the orange areas, those are the different wildlife areas within the Northwest Sands ecological landscape. Originally, this landscape was, and I'm gonna pass these around, and then whoever's at the end, if you would just wanna put them in a pile, I'll catch them at the end. Here's another map with the same outline that shows what lies within the St. Croix watershed versus what lies within the Lake Superior watershed. This was done by Greg Seitz of St. Croix 360. A lot of the photos that I'll have come from the collection at the Gordon Wascott Historical Society. So because of the sand, it was very drought prone, and because it was very drought prone, it was frequently swept by wildfire. So it wouldn't have been the forest that we see today. It would have been more open land like the bird sanctuary in Gordon, or some of you are familiar with the Barnes Barrens up here, or the Makwa Barrens over by Makwa, or the Namakagan Barrens down between Gordon and Danbury. And then further south, Croix Meadows. A lot of people know Croix Meadows for its marshes, but the upland areas are barrens. So the barrens habitat is where fire sweeps the landscape and basically keeps it in a brush prairie sort of habitat. So the Northwest Sands was not the giant forest that we know today. It was either open prairie, brush prairie, young regenerating trees, swept by fire, and then back to prairie again. And the forest really came into being later when fire control came into being. So this is a map of fire-dependent vegetation in Wisconsin. And if you look at, obviously, the area that's glowing red matches the same outline over there. That's our sand barrens, and that's how much the sand has an effect on the frequency of the fire, and the frequency of the fire affects the vegetation. So it was very high, dry, and open land. So this would be an example of roads we're all familiar with. You know, our sand roads that just go on forever, just jack pine, jack pine, jack pine. That's actually not a very typical landscape type. We're very used to it around here, but it's actually considered globally rare. And when the land is managed by fire, this is a picture of our bird sanctuary in Gordon. And the reason we call it the bird sanctuary is originally these wildlife areas were managed for sharp-tailed grouse habitat. The sharp-tailed grouse have to have an open prairie or brush prairie landscape in order to survive, and when the trees grew up, the sharp-tailed grouse started to go away. So mostly it was, the interest of hunting groups, people who hunted sharp-tail, organized to get these wildlife areas established. So that sort of is a background of what the Northwest Sands is. So picture that whole area in this trajectory from near St. Croix Falls to near Bayfield, high, dry, open land, prairie, brush prairie, not the forest we see today. That came later. Except for in areas along lakes, rivers, lowlands where the soil didn't dry out as much. That's where you would find heavy timber, but for the most part. So getting to sort of the formation of the trail, a lot of you would be familiar with the Brule St. Croix portage, how the Brule and St. Croix River have a source that's nearly the same source. And by canoeing up the one river, you can portage over to the other river, and that was how people historically would get from Lake Superior to the St. Croix or Mississippi watershed. And that's how we tell history, sort of very simplistically, but in reality, this had very little utility. It would be very good to use under ideal circumstances, but you couldn't use it in the winter, you couldn't use it when the water was too high. If any of you are familiar below the Gordon Dam, it gets very shallow and rocky. After the spring runoff, it's hard to even canoe down, much less canoe up. So you couldn't use it in the winter, you couldn't use it when the water was too high, you couldn't use it when the water was too low. And if you got out to Lake Superior, you could end up windbound for days. So usually, we know a lot about the Brule St. Croix portage because explorers, missionaries, white people that journaled wrote about taking the Brule St. Croix portage. Because even if it was very difficult, they would take it because they didn't want to get lost. And the alternative was this footpath that went across the Northwest Sands. The Northwest Sands were in this beautiful trajectory from the St. Croix up to Lake Superior. Their predominant place that they were trying to get to was LaPointe on Madeline Island. LaPointe early on was the center of the Ojibwe people. The first fur traders made it their center. The first missionaries made it their center. It really was the center of all regional activity. And so you had this beautiful trajectory that you could use pretty much year-round, and it was high, dry, and open land. This is something that I just found out about last year, and I've been researching stuff in this area forever. It was George Stuntz, the first government surveyor in this area. I don't know if he exactly surveyed right here, but a lot of northern Wisconsin, northeastern Minnesota he surveyed. And he said there were 3 portages to Lake Superior. So there was the Brule St. Croix portage, and granted this portage across the Northwest Sands, they called it a portage, and they did carry their canoes, which is just mind-blowing to me. They would talk about going from LaPointe, canoeing across the bay, and then they would say, and then the portage began. And they would carry their canoes all the way to the St. Croix, which is just mind-blowing to me. But usually they had Indian guides or Métis, people of mixed, Indian and European descent, usually that were part of Fur Trade Society, and they would hire them as packers. So they portage, but they would have hired people to carry their canoes. But this one speaks to a third portage that I did not even know about. They would canoe up the Eau Claire River to the Eau Claire Lakes, and then portage over to Pigeon Lake, portage over to the White River, and then take the White River out to Chequamegon Bay. And that was the route that would be taken if you were going further east towards the UP and the Copper Country. I'd never known that before. And I think if George Stuntz hadn't written that down, I don't think anybody would have known. So the trail I'll speak about is what around here you guys would call the St. Croix Trail. And granted, this trail is called different things by different people in different areas. And Gordon is sort of at that sweet spot. On this side of Gordon, everybody calls it the St. Croix Trail. If you go that way from Gordon, everybody calls it the Bayfield Trail. And it's because it was called by what it was taking you to. So it's not that it was called the St. Croix Trail in the St. Croix country and the Bayfield Trail in the Bayfield country, it's the opposite. You guys are in Bayfield County, you're closer to Bayfield. You call it the St. Croix Trail because that was the trail to the St. Croix. People in the St. Croix Valley would call it the Bayfield Trail because that was the trail that would take them to Bayfield.
Can we ask a question?
Sure.
I had seen a map that it said Gordon Trail also.
Yeah, I got that in here too.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, that would be people in Bayfield would have been taking it to Gordon, so they might have called it the Gordon Trail. This is the earliest map that I found of it, or earliest mention, and this is from the Chequamegon History website. If any of you are familiar with that, if not, you should find it. It's a phenomenal resource. But and this is kind of small, it's from the 1820 Cass Schoolcraft expedition, and they called it the Great Trail to the Fall of On Country. And the Fall of On Country is what the French called the St. Croix region. Fall of On was the French word for wild rice. And so because of the wild rice in the St. Croix, it was called the Fall of On Country. So 1820, that early they have the map. This is a map, these are some words that I just zeroed in on from a map that a fur trader had sketched, I think for Henry Schoolcraft. And it says, and this tells you what the French called it. It says Carte des Grands Chemins, and it means map of the Grand Footpath. So the French would have basically referred to it as the Grand Footpath. I was trying to translate it in French using Google Translate, and I couldn't figure anything out. And actually, if you use modern French, they use a different word for footpath now. But I knew somebody in Paris that had been a foreign exchange student at our high school in Northwood, and I sent that to him, and he said, "Oh, that's old." And then he told me, "We don't use that anymore, but old people would have called that footpath." This is from Joseph Nicolay. He published this map in 1843. It's based on observations when he came through in 1837, and that sort of shows it on a longer trajectory. So the original footpath, if you're coming from Chequamegon Bay, there were two forks. One started by the mouth of the Sioux River, and the other started kind of by Boyd's Creek, Whittlesea Creek. And then they both came and met in Barnes, and then formed one. And if you were coming from Chequamegon Bay to the St. Croix, you would have gotten on the water pretty much around Gordon. If you were going upstream, you would want to avoid going up through those shallow areas below the Gordon Dam. And then it would have started at a spot called Women's Portage, which is down by the CCC Bridge, or out by the Namakagon Barrens, if anybody's familiar with that. So what happened is, that was sort of the native footpath form of it. And what happened is when lumbermen came into the St. Croix Valley, they started creating roads and lumbering trails up the St. Croix Valley that connected in. And then it became a continuous footpath all the way from Fort Snelling in the Twin Cities, Stillwater, all the activity of the lower St. Croix, all the way up to LaPointe. And it really had importance for early Europeans in the area because Fort Snelling was a major outpost of the American military, American settlement, and in LaPointe on Madeline Island was, the major center of fur trade activities. Government agents also would be going there. So between those 2 points, it really took on a lot of significance. This is the two different forks that I was speaking of. Actually, I should have really highlighted in 3. The one that came out the mouth of the Sioux River is there. Later, there was one that was altered to go to Bayfield when Bayfield was founded. And then the one at the base there. But they basically come together and they merge in Barnes. Just east of Island Lake. So this is something that is really interesting to me. Does this landscape look familiar to all of you? If I saw this picture, I would think this looked familiar to me. So when early Europeans were going across this trail, while our north woods might have seemed really foreign to them, the towering white pine forest and everything, our barrens habitat was not foreign or alien to them. There's very similar barrens in Europe. A lot of Europe was glaciated, and when glaciers melted, it created sand outwash, and the sand outwash create the same drought-prone circumstances, and therefore you have fire-dependent vegetation that even though it's different plants, it looks and feels very similar, and it even smells the same. So this is actually from where my in-laws live in the Netherlands. And this is a wildlife area called the Leusder Heide in the Netherlands. And we go biking out through there, and I just can't believe it. I mean, I feel like I'm in Gordon or Barnes or Wascott. It's bizarre. So when early Europeans came across the trail, they would often journal about how it felt familiar to them. I remember there was a Scottish guy that said it reminded him of the moorlands of Scotland. And I'd heard that term before, moorlands. I didn't know what it was. It's barrens. It's what we have here.
And then, Brian, can I ask, how do the barrens relate to these big Norway pines that everybody was cutting down in the 1900s?
Yeah, so at least Gordon and Barnes, were major activities of logging, but the logging wouldn't have been in, say, the areas where you just go and you drive for miles and miles and it's just jack pine, jack pine, jack pine. Those areas were probably more brush prairie or probably more open land or young regenerating forest. The heavy timber would have been off the edges of the sand barrens or along the waterways. So probably around the lakes, around the rivers, or off the edges. If you went, south on 27, when you run out of the sands, the vegetation just completely changes. Out by the Owens, out by the copper mines, that's where the big timber would have been. The straightaway between here and Gordon, or, between here and Solon, where you're just going through jack pine, jack pine, jack pine, there was no logging activity. In fact, Ox Creek had not one logging dam on it at all. I just found an article where William Santry, the lumberman, had bought up most of the land in Ox Creek for his own personal wildlife preserve. Because it was one of the only waterways not spoiled by any logging activity. So there was almost no logging in the sand barrens, but we had loggers here, but they logged off the periphery or along waterways. So in the winter, they would have used dog sleds to go through here on the St. Croix Trail. And this is an article from 1851, and it basically speaks in detail about the taking of the dog train. I'll just pass it around and let you read it, but it's sort of interesting. It talks about them going from LaPointe down to basically down to St. Paul and how it was very bad and almost impassable and everything else. And then when they got there, they reported they brought no news of any importance. This is just another early map. It says trail from Long Island Bay to St. Croix River. I was just trying to show again how many different names it has. It was the St. Croix Trail, the St. Croix Road, the Bayfield Trail, the Bayfield Road, Long Island Bay to St. Croix River, Trail to LaPointe, the Grand Footpath, Great Trail to the Fall of On Country. It's really hard to speak about this sometimes because it had so many names. And also some of the names would go to multiple things. There was also a road between here or between Bayfield and Superior that was called the Bayfield Road. So if you're trying to research our Bayfield Road and you use that term, you'll get hits for that. There's other trails called the St. Croix Trail, and so that gets confusing. There was an early trail from Superior down to the St. Croix that Superior people called the St. Croix Trail or the St. Croix Road. So after it kind of became a route of importance for the earliest Europeans in the area, they very quickly needed a United States post office at LaPointe, and they established a post office as early as 1837. And if you think about in the history of this area, how early 1837 is, I mean, that's before any statehood at all. I originally had found postal records for this trail in the 1840s. And I think every time I gave this talk, I would say a date, and then the date just kept moving earlier and earlier. But yeah, it was in the 1830s. This one is from 1846, and it's a memorial to Congress to create a mail route. But I found ones earlier than that. So it was United States Postal Route 4444 from the Falls of St. Croix to LaPointe, 180 miles and back once every 2 weeks. So just think, in Barnes, there was an official United States mail route going through Barnes before Wisconsin was even a state, which is, I mean, that's before the Civil War, long before the Civil War.
What did they call this area during that time?
Boy. Yeah, around, once you get to St. Croix, like around Gordon, they would call that the Fall of On Country. Out here, I think this would actually still have been considered the Fall of On Country. I think that Fall of On term was a pretty wide swath.
What does that mean? Fall of On, is that?
Wild race.
Oh, okay.
It's the French term for wild race.
Wild races.
Yeah.
They used to call everything.
So I think it became passable by wagons around early 1850s. That date is a little fuzzy. I had it written down somewhere at home. They kept improving it. At first, there weren't wagons, it was just men on foot. Oh, I should mention, the early mail carriers were usually Métis men of mixed ancestry from the fur trade era. They usually had Ojibwe mothers and fur trade fathers. And the American Fur Company had gone bankrupt right about the same time that mail carrying became a thing on this trail. So it was this real perfect transferable skill for these men that were used to carrying large, heavy packs during the fur trade. They would just carry large, heavy packs of mail. So it really was an economic opportunity that fit with what they knew to do and what their skills were. And of course, they would have all the other skills besides just carrying. I mean, how to set up camp, how to cook for yourself out in the wilderness, and everything else. It became passable by wagon in the early 1850s. And then this is in 1856, and it says it's when the first post wagon went through, so when the mail was actually carried by a wagon. And this was actually in a newspaper in Washington, D.C. And it says, information was received at the post office department of a splendid line of 4-horse post coaches started between St. Paul and Bayfield in Wisconsin, where a few years ago, white men had never trod. I think that's an exaggeration, but but it was in the wilderness. And it's interesting that this would have been news in Washington, D.C. when this trail became open for wagon passage for both the post office and for stagecoaches. It was making news in New York and Washington, D.C. because in terms of the westward expansion of the country, there was such an interest in a connection between the greatest of the Great Lakes and the greatest of the rivers, between Lake Superior and the Mississippi. So it'd be the first wagon passage between the greatest of the Great Lakes and the greatest of the rivers. In terms of westward expansion of the country, that was national news. So, this is when the Minnesota Stage Company, this is from 1859. This is when the first stagecoach went through. Henry Rice founded Bayfield, and Henry Rice was a very powerful senator from Minnesota, and he needed to promote his new settlement, get settlers up to his new settlement, get supplies up to his new settlement. And Henry Rice was very influential in getting a line of the Minnesota Stage Company to go to Bayfield. And so what's interesting is there's a lot that's written about Wisconsin stagecoach history, but it never mentions the stage line because those historians and writers aren't aware of it because it was a Minnesota Stage Company line. And there's a lot of writers and historians in Minnesota that write about the Minnesota Stage Company, but they miss it because they're not looking for a Minnesota Stage Company line outside of Minnesota. So it's interesting that there's nothing really comprehensively written about it until recently. A friend of ours, Don Monson, wrote a book. It's not published that you can buy it online or anything. You'd have to just contact Don and he can make you a copy. And I feel really a little bit worthless right now because I didn't bring his contact information. But if you find me or message me or contact me after this, I can get you in connection with Don. But he wrote a really good book and did a lot of in-depth research on it. And that really is the first comprehensive writing of it. There's mentions of it in different writings, but not any one thing that comprehensively writes about it. So in 1859, this was an advertisement in Plymouth, Indiana, about the stagecoach opening through here. So when they created the stage line, they had to have stopping places, and that's how Gordon came to be. Antoine and Sarah Gordon were both Métis, Ojibwe mothers, fur trade fathers, lived at LaPointe on Madeline Island. And when the stagecoach came into being, Henry Rice needed stopping places, and they were usually at watering points. So the crossing of the Eau Claire River was a watering point, and Antoine and Sarah Gordon went and had a stopping place there. And they really did a bunch of different economic activities. They, lodged travelers. They had a trading post that, kind of turned into a store. They had a farm. They had trout ponds. They guided. They all sorts of different things. So that's how Gordon came into being. So I think Antoine and Sarah came in 1858. They established a post office in Gordon in 1860. And that's always kind of looked to as our founding date, when we became a town. South of Gordon, where it crossed the Namakagon, was the watering point stopping place before Gordon, and then after Gordon, it was like Island Lake. And then that sort of migrated to Spider Lake, near Iron River. At some point, they abandoned the Island Lake stopping place, and it became at Spider Lake. This was Antoine Gordon's,
Excuse me, but where was Young's trading post then? By Oxford, wasn't that in the line of that?
It would have been after the era of the stagecoach, but it would have still been a stopping place for travelers and lumber wagons.
Okay.
Yeah. At the crossing of the Oxkirk, too, there would have been a stopping place. A little bit later, not stagecoach era, but this is Charles Dingley. He was Mrs. Gordon's brother, and he carried the mail south of Gordon. And then Antoine and Sarah Gordon's son, William Gordon, carried the mail north of Gordon. So he, from when he was pretty young, actually, I think even a teenager, he would carry the mail on foot. And in his time, it was Spider Lake that he would go to. So he would walk on foot from Gordon all the way to Spider Lake, and then spend the night there with either the Morrisons or the Luskys, and then catch the other mail and walk all the way back to Gordon.
Now, was that the Spider Lake west of Gordon, or is this a different?
By Iron River.
Iron River.
Yeah. This is one of the more interesting events in history that all of these Ojibwe chiefs and headmen of the Lake Superior region all went to go meet with Abraham Lincoln, and they convened at Madeline Island, and then they walked this trail all the way down to St. Paul, and then took a riverboat to where the first railroad had reached the Mississippi, and then went by train all the way east to Washington to meet with Lincoln. So there's places where you can still see this trail out in the woods. And in fact, Gordon's Main Street, if you're in downtown Gordon, the trail went right through there. when you're in one of these spots where you know where the trail was, and there's places out in the woods where you can still see it, it's interesting to me to just think all of these chiefs and headmen on their way to meet Abraham Lincoln walked right through there. That's, to me, that's really interesting stuff. So that's sort of the stagecoach era. And that was all very practical. It was, they needed to get mail, they needed to get supplies. The very first recreation in this area, where people are really coming for the explicit purpose to recreate, was really by the stagecoach. In Harper's Magazine, there's some wealthy New Yorkers that took it and they sort of write it almost like a travel log along the way. And by the way, you'll love this in Barnes, because when they stopped in Gordon, they talked about how ugly it was. And then when they got to Barnes, they talked about how beautiful it was. Yeah. But the discovery of the Brule River, a lot of people don't realize, was because of this trail. A lot of the early families on the Brule, would have come from after Duluth and Superior had settled and came across roads from Duluth and Superior. But people don't realize prior to that, imagine when there was no Duluth and Superior. This is from 1850, and it's in a newspaper in St. Paul. The stagecoach trail would have come in the sand barrens not too far from the headwaters of the Brule. And there was a spur off of this trail that went to the Brule to a point that was called Gordon's Landing. And Antoine Gordon had, Mrs. Gordon's cousins had set up some sort of a camp there where they would extract fish and fur from the Brule River Valley to sell at Antoine Gordon's trading post. And I met with Phil Ordway, that owns the Ordway estate, last year. And still on their property, they still call that spot Gordon's Landing. And they even have a segment of that trail on their property that they still call the Gordon Trail, which I thought was pretty fascinating. But this was more or less a tourism advertisement in 1850. And it says, the Brule River up north, look on your map. I mean, this is before anybody would have known what the Brule was. Our informant says is the trout stream par excellence of the whole world. I'll let you read the rest. But
Just like the crawdads are today.
yeah. So really the discovery of the Brule really first happened with this trail. And actually the first buildings at Cedar Island, which is the big estate where Coolidge stayed on the Brule, those supplies actually came into Gordon by train and then over this trail out to build Cedar Island. And a lot of people don't realize that Gordon would have been the closest town to the Brule, which is not all that intuitive now. But you picture there was no Solon, there was no Nevadaman. There was just this trail. That was the only way to.
There was a fort there. What year would that have been?
Oh, that's way earlier. There was a fort on Lake St. Croix, I think in the late 1600s.
Okay.
That would have been long gone before any of this. Yeah.
20 years ago, maybe.
So really what changed everything is when the railroads came in. So this is a picture of our railroad depot in Gordon. As soon as the railroads came into being, the trail just very quickly disappeared. When a lot of you are probably familiar with William Purcell's book, St. Croix Trail Country. And the Grays were a wealthy family from Illinois that had bought the place on Island Lake after the stagecoach was abandoned. And they, he's writing about staying there when he would have been, a kid in the 1890s. And they talk about this trail as if it's ancient history then. So in the 1890s, they were already talking about the trail as if it was a historic relic. When the trail, I just put that in more of a reminder to myself to talk about the impact of the railroads. That's our depot in Gordon. So before the railroads, all of these communities on this trajectory would have been very closely connected. So Gordon would have been very closely connected with Island Lake, with Spider Lake, with Bayfield, and then to the south it would have been very connected with the area around Danbury, the area around Grantsburg. And as soon as the railroads came into being, our orientation lost that angled trajectory, and all of a sudden our railroads went very linear north-south, and then our highways kind of followed the same. And then we got strings of communities in these northwest or north to south trajectories. So you get Highway 35, Highway 53, Highway 27, Highway 63, and all of a sudden these communities reorient. And they lose connections with other communities that historically had been connected on this axis. So my own family kind of came into being in this era. after the stagecoach. So that guy up there is my great-great-grandfather, George Vines. And this is my great-grandmother at Island Lake when she was a little girl. So they came in and worked for the Grays, I believe, and then homesteaded off of Island Lake. What happened after the lumbering era was a lot of the land was sold for the purpose of farming, agriculture, kind of the typical American story is, get your homestead and, make your farm. And it just didn't work in all of the sand. So, so that's also sort of, my family story sort of fits that, is a lot of you might recognize this house. So that was built for my great-grandmother after she divorced her husband, super scandalous. And my grandmother lived there as a little girl, and then she remarried and they moved off to a different homestead. I actually have pictures of that. I was trying to find one to bring when it was just freshly white painted and had lace curtains in the windows, and it was beautiful. So what happened is not all of them, but most of the homesteads went bust. George Barnes went completely bust. By the time he died, he didn't own any of his land anymore. I've also found newspaper articles about how a lot of the timber he was going to harvest was wiped out by forest fire. So again, the stories of our landscape, the fire and the sand, it just was, people had one idea for what they wanted to do with this land, and the land had another idea for what it wanted to happen. A lot of those homesteads that went bust went tax forfeit, and that's why Bayfield County and Douglas County have such large land holdings of public forest land today. And then it really morphed into the tourism era. People started discovering the lakes and discovering the forests. By the 1930s, they were establishing the wildlife areas to preserve some of the Barrens habitat for the sharp-tailed grouse. And this is something really fun. It's a Douglas County tourism, and actually your dad had donated this. Claudia's dad donated this to the museum. It was a 1933 tourism map of Douglas County, but I circled down here about it draws in a little Indian with a bow and arrow and ... and it shows the old trail to LaPointe. So what's interesting is sort of this golden era of conservation when we had the WPA and the CCC and they were building dams and parks and everything else. There was an era that had a little bit of a fascination with this trail. And Eldon Marple, that was the historian over at Hayward, a lot of you that are local history researchers would know Eldon's name, and he wrote a lot of articles for the Visitor magazine in Hayward. He said when he was a young man in working for the CCC that the CCC had documented the trail, and he said where it crossed the county line, they put in a historic marker for it when he worked for the CCC. And he doesn't say which county line. I think he meant Burnett County, because I've never heard of any markers of any kind up in this area. And I think he was working down in that area. In that conservation era, they did things like build fire towers. That's actually why I wore this shirt today too, our Gordon Fire Tower. And all of a sudden they built fire towers and ranger stations, and that's when fire control really came into being. And that's when our forests really grew up. I remember my dad, whenever we'd come out to Barnes, when we would get to 27, he would always point north towards Brule, and he would say, my mom said when there was never a tree in that direction, it was just wide open all the way up to the roof. He used to say that all the time. And then he would also say how proud he was that his dad was part of planting the plantations that filled in that area.
Well, all the kids did, school kids had planted.
Yeah, and that's something that's so counterintuitive that, we use the term tree hugger for, the environment. And it's hard to wrap your minds around that within the Northwest Sands, trees are good in some areas, along the rivers and in places. But when you get those areas that were just wide open, the land wants to be open. That's why if we weren't controlling the fires would burn it all up. If the jack pine budworm is a natural process that comes through to take out the trees, and the land wants to be open. And being that we don't have fire, really clear cuts are the next closest thing to mimicking sort of that habitat that the sharp-tailed grouse need. And even myself, when I was a kid and I'd see a clear cut, I'd be like, oh, why did they have to do that? And you really have to reorient your brain to realize in some areas, trees are our environmental devastation. And so in this area, a lot of trees are our environmental devastation.
In California, I'm
sure, if they, we could have fires.
Oh, yeah.
What's wrong with these? You know, years ago, when we first moved here, there'd be wildfires, well, so what?
Yeah.
Or you would have blueberries for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
yeah, and we take care of that, some of those buildings.
That's actually a really good point. And you actually just triggered a thought I skipped over about how Native people use the barrens. Native people from LaPointe and Schwamigan Bay and from Odena would actually come all the way out to Gordon or Barnes and set up blueberry camps. And they also would manipulate the land by intentionally setting fires just for blueberry production. And Judy just had a good point if you didn't hear it. She said, I bet there were a lot less wood ticks. That might
All
have,
this
yeah.
underbrush that we have now.
Now we
Yeah.
have the turkeys to take care of the rest.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe.
So then with these wildlife areas, for a long time the wildlife areas were just sort of oriented towards once a year there would be sharp-tailed grouse hunters that would come do bird dog trials and whatnot. And now there's been more of an awareness of doing more interesting things with the wildlife areas, and there's friends groups that are interested in education about the barrens and the sands and the geology and the ecology and the plants. And this is a group of the Friends of the Bird Sanctuary, which I'm a board member of. The Bird Sanctuary, for those that you don't know, it's officially called the Douglas County Wildlife Area, but everybody calls it the Bird Sanctuary. It's between Gordon and Solon. And I put that in there to trigger, if you remember that first map where the Northwest Sands had those dots where the wildlife areas were, each wildlife area has an auto tour where you can go to that wildlife area and they have little points of interest that you can drive around that wildlife area and see those points of interest. So like the Croix Meadows and the Namakogan Barrens. And when I first joined the Friends of the Bird Sanctuary Board, they wanted to create an auto trail for people to cross the whole trajectory of the Northwest Sands and learn about things about geology and ecology of the Northwest Sands. And when they first rolled out the map and showed it to me, I was like, wow, this basically follows all the modern roads that almost exactly follow the St. Croix Trail, the Stagecoach Trail, the Grand Footpath, and for the same reason, because those people were following the sand barrens. And the whole point of this wildlife tour was to follow the sand barrens. So when I got involved, because I'm just sort of a local history geek, I suggested, well, why don't we actually very intentionally follow the modern roads that closely approximate this trail? And then we can tell stories that focus on the geology, the ecology, the history, and the culture. And especially areas where they intersect, where the human history is shaped by the geology and the ecology. So like, homesteads actually the town of Bingo that was up here, was completely wiped out by wildfire. That would be a great story of how the human history of the Northwest Sands was shaped by the geology and the ecology. So our idea became scenic byways in Wisconsin kind of have to follow more main roads. So we kind of went with an auto trail model. And the auto trails kind of have a history of their own. When motoring kind of first became a thing of recreation, people would just pick roads that already exist and they'd be like, that sounds like an interesting route. And they would, basically draw a line on it, call it a thing, and they would assign it a name and some little symbols and then tell people to go drive on it for fun. And so this is in Minnesota, those are some of the early auto trails. Somebody put together a really nice article about it. And it was really a fad that was all over the country. And these are some of the symbols of some different auto trails around the country. So the idea became to create the Northwest Sands Auto Trail. So to have this auto trail that goes across the Northwest Sands, and we brought in the historical and cultural perspective by closely following the old St. Croix Trail. And it tells stories about the Northwest Sands that are geological, ecological, historical, or cultural. So all of this kind of got going, and then COVID hit. And we've done a lot of engagement south of Gordon, so a lot in the Namakogan Barrens and down in Grantsburg and Wolf Creek and Fort Fallabon down that way. We just had started on the northern end, and some of you were actually there. We did one at the Highland Town Hall, but I'm so glad we're redoing this because there's so many more people here now than there was then. And then there was a spike in COVID again, and then all of our northern ones got canceled. So Iron River canceled on us, Bayfield canceled on us. We're going to do one of the Great Lakes Visitor Center cancel on, which is fine. So that was in 2021. And then last year, my time was just wiped out. I was fighting a zoning issue with Douglas County that required 11 public hearings. And then we went straight from that into trying to save our post office in Gordon, which was a huge organizing effort. And then my mom got COVID and was hospitalized and had a long recovery. So 2022 was just wiped out for me. So we're just kind of getting going again this year. I have maps to kind of show you the route, but the maps are very, obviously from St. Croix Falls up to Bayfield, there's not a lot of detail. So I printed this off to just show where it would go through Barnes, because I figure people have local interest in that. And then these are maps of the entirety of it. And like I said, you can't see a lot of detail in these, but these ones you can actually keep if you're interested. I don't know, I was expecting a crowd this big. I hope there's enough for everyone. And keep in mind that this is draft. So and don't pay any attention to if you think that some of these, there's points that should be on here and aren't and should or whatever. Get a hold of me and let me know your thoughts, because we're actually doing this to get feedback from the public. And just keep in mind this is draft. So don't, go put this in the museum, because this isn't like an artifact forever. This is a total evolving thing. But you can grab one and keep those. So that's sort of what the project is about. Where we're at right now is we're going to complete our public engagement with the northern end up to Bayfield. And then over the course of the winter, we're going to finalize points of interest and get photographs and content for all of them. And it'll start with a web version, where by spring we'll have some sort of a website that you can go to. We have a GIS consultant that has put together a phenomenal map that I'm so not a techie person. I mean, you can see I'm passing around paper, that's how techie I am. But he has it where your GPS in your car will somehow communicate with this thing, and it'll like navigate you through the whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's all these layers, and you hit a button and it'll show, the wildlife areas, or it'll show where you are in relation to the North Country Trail, or different things. I don't know. It's the tech part of it just blows my mind continuously. So it'll start as an online thing. It'll start electronic, and then we'll hope to get grants, get funding, and then we can have money for brochures and paper things, and then maybe eventually get markers in the landscape at significant points, and then maybe eventually signage. Like, this is a thing that can just begin with a framework that can just be added to over a really long time. So I'll probably be working this the rest of my life.
I have a question.
Sure.
How much of this trail is like completely disused now, as opposed to like our roads? And there's an enormous number of ATV trails. Like, I go out on my bike, and there's hundreds of miles of trails in Bayfield County, probably. Is any of that contiguous with this? I noticed it's north of you, right?
Yeah.
It's not going through.
I'm glad you asked that. So most of it is not currently in use. Most of it, when I was a kid, a lot of it you could find and see, and that was actually kind of a pastime of mine, is I would find it and follow it for a ways, and then eventually it would be interrupted by furrowing or somebody had a homestead, and then it would be gone, but you would kind of know the trajectory it was, then you go around the other side and you find it, and then you follow it again. When I was a kid, that was a really fun pastime of mine. But, yeah, I was a young child. But especially with logging and furrowing, it's almost, so much of it is wiped out. I would really like to get a group to find those parts that are still intact and communicate with property owners and just make them aware, because they might not damage it if they were aware of it.
Yeah.
I knew one private piece of land where it must have been just fully intact, because this land had not changed hands in a century, and maybe since the 30s. And it sold, and I saw the signs, and I thought, oh, I should really contact them, and I didn't. And the next thing I know, it was like all furrow, and they just didn't know. There was actually somebody in here when I got here today that mentioned they have friends that had land that it is on, and they did know, which I think is a really cool thing. The Namakogon Barrens has quite a bit, and that's nice where it crosses the wildlife areas, because those wildlife areas, will stay intact. They're not going to be planted up or anything like that. So locally, the roads that people, that are still parts of it that are still in use, there's a Bayfield Road between Gordon and Barnes, and obviously that's named because it was the Bayfield Road, the whole thing. And then Webster Road, if any of you are familiar with Webster Road, up sort of northeast of here, that's part of it too. So,
I just assumed that Bayfield Road was part of the Bayfield Trail.
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's two Webster roads. One is like Bayfield Road, closer to Iron River, that goes east and west. And then
Okay.
there's one that goes north-south.
Yeah, it's the one that runs at kind of a little bit of a diagonal, and it's just east of Island Lake.
Where you had that fire.
So that just even if you
Yeah.
And then I do have one question,
Sure.
you're talking about the barrens and all this. Why in Gordon, on the west side of the highway is clay, and they have beautiful night colors? But
Yeah.
then on the east side, it's all sand. It rains, and the sand will, the water will soak in, but then the sand is still dry. Why is there such a difference?
Yeah.
Did the river go through there farther south than what we realized?
If you look at the topography, the St. Croix is what a geologist would call an underfit stream, where the stream was at one time much larger and then shrunk down, so it's a small stream within a huge stream bed. So that's why around, the areas around the St. Croix, you'll find a lot of clay, because that's clay deposited from the glacial river that went through there. So that's why it shrunk down to its current size. I learned that there was actually the Minnesota Geological Society did a tour of the Northwest Sands, and I only knew about it because a friend of mine in the cities told us about it, and so we signed up, and it was a Minnesota group, they were all from the cities, but they came up here to do a tour because they were geology geeks and they just had a fascination about the sands. I never knew you could possibly talk so much about our sand around here, but it was absolutely fascinating. And I couldn't even remember it all to replicate it. I would love to get that speaker to come speak at a bird sanctuary sometime. But the one thing I remember that just blew me away is I always heard about a lot of our hills around here were formed where blocks of ice from the glacier got buried under the sand, and then when those melted, the land dipped down and created what they call a kettle, and that's how we got a lot of our lakes and a lot of our, sort of the pitted landscape. But there was a second geological process that created a lot of the hills around here, and it never even occurred to me, a lot of our hills are ancient sand dunes. Because before vegetation would have stabilized it, I mean, think about all of this sand, like right after the glacier melted, and no vegetation has rooted to weigh it down. That sand must have been just whipping around like crazy. And so the geologists actually took us to a sand pit near Lake Nebagaman that had just beautifully excavated a vertical wall, and you could see the striation in the sands, sort of the layers where it was deposited, and it was all curvy. And he said when water lays down sand, it's level. But when wind lays down sand, it has that. So that's how he said you would know that particular hill was an ancient sand dune. That had never occurred to me.
And then did you see that map on, I think it was on Facebook? I had a copy of it, and it was on the green, but the whole northwest part of Douglas County was called LaPointe.
Yeah, well, all of this at one time was LaPointe County also. So it was LaPointe County before the other counties were carved out of it. How are we doing on time? Am I talking?
No, that's good, good. We got about 5 minutes left and we'll be done. First of all, thank you very much. Let's open it up to any more questions. I was planning on going over the context of trails that are Native Americans throughout the whole country. And what makes up the trails, what kind of trails they were, and how they would set them up, and what happened to the trails. But that takes between 5 and 50 minutes. And the 5 minutes, I thought, what the heck? Let's do it some other time. And we promised you you'd be home for dinner if you haven't already eaten. Now, if you have already eaten dinner, there's a special sweet here for dessert. It's from the Whole Wheat Bakery in New Richmond. They're $5 each. So I cut them in corners. They're supposed to be a donut, but they call it what? The St. Croix nut. Croix nut. And it's made out of a croissant pastry layered, and it's square with a hole in the middle that doesn't go to the all the way through. Talk about mouth-watering. I've cut them in quarters, so 16 can have one. Take home if you want to. Any other?
Qualified for being a male.
Just any other questions?
One more question. You mentioned about Mr. Gordon's, or Mrs. Gordon's brother was Dingle.
Yeah.
Did he do exploring also, or mining, or anything else?
No, he guided quite a bit. And actually something else I skipped over when I talked about how Gordon lived in the closest point to the Brule. I also recently found an article from 1863 of Antoine Gordon. People from down by Prescott, Wisconsin came up this trail to Gordon, and then Antoine Gordon took them by canoe and went over the portage to go fishing in the Brule. And it's weird to think that Gordon would have been the closest guiding point to the Brule, but that was because the only road coming through this entire region would have been the St. Croix Trail. And it also makes Antoine Gordon the first known guide on the Brule, which I think is
The
sort of...
reason I asked, shorter answer next time.
Sure.
The reason I asked was, there's a creek called Dingle Creek. Anyone heard of that?
Yeah, there's no connection.
Oh,
There was thought to be connection, but it was sort of flawed.
Well, let me tell you what I was daydreaming about. Speak up in a minute, just a minute. Dingle Creek attaches to the Ooms, which goes down to the Minnetonka and such, and then to the Howard River, the big river. And right where they have a junction, there's a copper mine. There are 3 copper mines there. That area was also mined by the Native Americans. And I'm not talking about 100 years, I'm talking 1,000 years. Along with all the mines up at the Keweenaw Peninsula also. And they mined so much it was actually traded all over the United States. Mainly the implements they made, I was going to show some pictures of them. And scientists at the U of M was able to do certain analysis to show where the copper came from. It's all elemental copper, not copper ore that's smelted, but pure copper with various impurities and various characteristics. They've shown that a number of mines, it can actually trace it back to the mine. And our mine here, unfortunately, was only found in a 2,000-year-old Indian village in northern Minnesota that traced right back to the mines here that the Native Americans mined 1,000 years ago. And it's right at Dingle Creek where it passes to the Ooms. So that's why I asked that
That's
question.
very interesting.
Well, now, back in the logging days,
Yeah.
they would have the bunkhouse and they would have the cook shanty.
Yeah.
And between them was called the dingle.
Yeah.
That's where the sides of beef would be held, frozen, of course, in the wintertime.
Yeah.
That's where people would hang out their socks to dry.
Yeah.
That was called the dingle. It was an overhang, but no sides on it.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody back in the logging days, because runoff from the dingle formed that creek or was near there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've often wondered about that
I've heard that
myself.
term too. I did some research on the term dingle, and the origin of it is just sort of a creek in a valley, is a dingle. So there also is a dingle creek out by Dairyland too, and maybe because it's a space between 2 buildings, that's also how it got the nickname. It's sort of I think a creek. It's something that runs between things. But it doesn't have any relation to the name. There was a theory that Mrs. Gordon's sister lived near Dingle Creek and her maiden name was Dingley, and somebody had thought, well, maybe it was Dingley because of her and it was corrupted into Dingle. But Mrs. Gordon's mother had a number of husbands, and actually that particular one didn't have the last name Dingley. So that was just a theory, but didn't.
We got about 2 minutes.
That, when you're speaking of the Dingle Creek, is there a waterfall there or something?
No.
Is it on the Owenston that there's a 13-foot drop?
That's how the Tatoga Tech.
It's just a
No,
canyon.
not Copper Falls,
No, the Tatoga Tech.
the Tatogative.
Yeah.
And the only
This
person I
area
know
is
who
just
knew
a
where it was
couple miles
John
southeast
Long.
of
and he knew right where it was, but we were cross-country skiing and we didn't want to get across the creek.
We know where we.
You've seen it? You've seen that, Paul?
Okay, in the back, is there any, there's a question.
No, you have to walk to it.
I just wanted to say that in the Cable Historical Museum, we do have copper spear plate on display. Very interesting.
Yeah, see those. By the way, the cable museum came here a half hour early because they thought we were out in the wilderness or something and didn't know how long it would take. So they helped get the coffee going, and especially the one that I overfilled it and got all over the floor. I didn't have time to clean it up. Then they made things and got things ready. So thank you, cable. Thank you for coming.
I really wasn't expecting this big of a group, so thanks for coming. This is actually, I was intimidated at first when I saw how many of you. But this was nice. So.
Yeah, thank you.